Eating disorders are really glamorized. It wasn't until that you were literally dying that people were like, oh, we have a problem here.
Finding out about your dad's affair is such a common story for so many kids, but it's so stigmatized and it's not something people talk about because of the sacredness of family, or there is always this small part that wants to idolize your parents and believe that everything is great. And then
I don't resent my mom. It took me years, obviously, to get to this point. I wish when I was a kid or a teenager, my frontal lobe would have been more developed and I would have understood this. And I think our relationship would have been better. But again, that's a 12-year-old mind has trouble comprehending that.
I want to write a book one day. I'd have to get a few people to agree, or it might not be what they wanted. So are your parents supportive of the memoir? Welcome back to Real Pod. I'm so excited to be talking to you again. Congratulations. I literally could not put your book down. And I'm not just saying that. I was obsessed with it.
Thank you.
It was such a detailed description of your whole life story, which I can't even imagine the process of going back and, you know, remembering all these specific instances, most of which are really dark, deep, and the things that we kind of maybe bring up a few times in therapy and closed circles, not necessarily in a book that everyone will read. You've always been candid about your mental health struggles and your journey, which is why I've always been a big admirer of you as a female athlete. So what made you want to write this memoir for the world?
My mom and I used to joke, like, we should write a book one day because some of this is wild. I don't know. I just feel like my life has always been, I don't want to say interesting because I just feel that's so, you know, I'm just like, oh, she's the most interesting person ever. But it has in a lot of ways, and especially because skating is a sport that everyone watches and everyone knows, but it's really, people only watch it at the Olympics. Other than that, you know, the general public has no idea what goes into figure skating, what that life is like, with the exception of if they've seen The Cutting Edge or like Blades of Glory. That's about it. And so just with that, you know, just being a random 8-year-old and then 10 years later being at the Olympics and having an Olympic medal, the mental health struggles, just a lot of stuff I feel like has gone on in my life that I wanted to talk about. I didn't want to write a sports memoir. I wanted to write a memoir from an athlete's kind of point of view that wasn't your fluffy, you know, sports memoir if they started the sport, stuff went well, and then maybe one bad thing happened and then they won. And like, that's it.
The classic hero's journey.
Yeah, like that's such a wonderful tale. I just feel my story's been a little bit more of a dark comedy.
I can validate you do have one of the most interesting life stories I've ever read. Like, seriously, the amount of things that you had to overcome and that you had to endure and that you pushed through. First of all, I think everyone should read your book because I could not put it down. It was amazing. Your book is called Out of Shape, Worthless Loser. I'm obsessed with the title. How did you come up with it, and what was the motivation behind it?
I took some inspiration from Jeanette McCurdy's book, you know, like I'm Glad My Mother's Dead. I thought that title was just so profound. And I just love that it kind of sucker punched you in the face and it wasn't what you expected. And it had like, that was definitely like dark comedy. And so for mine, when we were looking at book titles, I know I didn't want anything that was a pun on Grace or Graceful or Gold.
Not so graceful. A memoir by Gracie Gold.
Yeah, if anything, like, yeah, like Disgraceful Gold. I guess it's probably one I threw out there.
That's a good one.
Thank you. And it's just the name that I gave to, you know, the voice that lives in your head that tells you you're trash or like there's something wrong with you and just that you should do better. And it's an accumulation of, I guess, like your own self-esteem issues, stuff that other people have told you, expectations of yourself and others, and just like reconciling that voice and like, how do I live with it? It was really between that and failed anorexic, but I have other demons besides an eating disorder. So we ultimately went with Out of Shape, Worthless Loser.
Well, I think it's brilliant, and it definitely made me want to read the book, and I loved it. So you guys killed it. Did you feel, though, that you had to kind of weigh the pros and cons of like wanting your full story to be out there and knowing that that would involve, you know, being really transparent about your parents' marriage and the infidelity that, your dad pursued and your mom's own struggles. I oftentimes am like, I want to write a book one day. And then I'm like, I'd have to get a few people to like, I'm either going to have to get people to agree or it might not be what they wanted. So like, are your parents supportive of the memoir and have you spoke to them about it?
I mean, I know they both know obviously that I'm writing a memoir, and I struggled a lot with writing about my mom the most because she has first like she's had a crazy life, and like she's been dealt some of the worst hands since birth. And I feel like it's hard. I don't really want to be a parent. It might not really, I mean, I don't at all. But writing about my mom was definitely the hardest because I know that she over 95% of the time did the best she could with what she was dealing with. And I, in some ways, hope that women that have been married to narcissists and sociopaths will kind of like resonate with her story. And a lot of times that she was, I felt like maybe mean or short or difficult. A lot of times that's because something was going on with her marriage and with her own life. And she really tried to paint my father as a good man and a good dad as long as she could. But I did not appreciate that as a child or certainly a teenager. But growing up now, and I'm like, oh, to be married to, a sociopath and a narcissist and an addict that's an unhealed addict, also trying to raise twin daughters. My father participated in the family financially, but in a lot of ways, I identify with being raised by a single mom. She essentially raised an Olympian and, a big finance star kind of by herself in a lot of ways, and just I didn't really appreciate her struggle until I was older, but there are definitely some stories in the book that maybe don't paint her in the best light, but I don't resent my mom. And it took me years, obviously, to get to this point. I've always respected my mom. In some ways, I wish when I was a kid or a teenager, my frontal lobe would have been more developed and I would have understood this. And I think our relationship would have been better. But again, that's the 12-year-old's, even 16, like 19-year-old mind has trouble comprehending that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's like the story of getting older, right? Is then being able to think, oh my gosh, our parents were literally just like trying to live their life the way that we are now as we become older and get adults. And there's no manual and perfect way. And for what it's worth, I did take that from the book that your mom literally did the best she could, and that's relative to each person and their own experience. And I feel like what you opened up about with finding out about your dad's affair is such a common story for so many kids, but it's so stigmatized and it's not something people talk about because of the sacredness of family, or there is always this small part that wants to like idolize your parents and believe that, everything is great. And then I think as a reader and someone who used to watch you when you were skating, you talk a lot about the way that we perceive figure skating, and it's this perfect performance, and you were compared to Grace Kelly and you were supposed to be, America's sweetheart. And then when you went home, all of the things that you were dealing with personally in your family in the pursuit of the Olympics was so far from, the cookie cutter life that the media and world maybe thought that you were living.
Yeah. And, especially in the 2000s, like early 2010s, like the Midwestern family, it had a certain look to it. And it was, a crime, or it felt like a sin to talk about these things. And then to find out like it wasn't just an affair that we had, to find out that my mom this whole time was really trapped with this kind of emotional terrorist in her life. And that while trying to also raise an Olympic figure skater. And yeah, it was just kind of strange. I call it like in my head, like the dollhouse effect. The Melanie Martinez, her song, like Dollhouse, really, I almost could have just like skipped the memoir and just been like, oh no, this is the memoir. It's like this song actually, like almost to a T. But it was difficult when I was younger because I didn't have the words or understand quite what it was. I just knew that the vibes were off.
Mm-hmm. As someone who was so used to portraying maybe the opposite of what was really going on, you've seemed to step into so much truth and vulnerability and doing it in such a public way. How have you tapped into that?
Well, I've like always been probably too honest. And, when I was younger, it was a huge problem. My mom was like, Gracie, filter your filter. You can't just say whatever you think immediately. And it took me a long time to even develop a filter. And so, if anything, in some ways, the dollhouse effect and like lying to the media was easier because it just kind of felt like this different person, kind of like Gracie Gold developed. But in the book, again, I wanted to write a memoir and not a fluffy sports memoir. So to be selectively vulnerable didn't feel right. I had to tell my story and my truth as it is, even if it is strange. For a lot of years, I felt like people don't really know me. And, I don't know if that's a shield but I was like, oh, that's kind of nice. So I have thought like, wow, like the whole world might know me and know me like pretty intimately. But also, I said I was going to write a memoir and my story and all of its truths, and that it wasn't going to be sugar coated or fluffy or for kids. And, I just followed that through.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of athletes out there who want to achieve something like an Olympic gold medal or making it to the Olympics. But I feel like your story really captures how grueling the process is. And I think the thing that, realizing and just reading what you wrote is how, despite all your preparation or how badly you wanted it, sometimes it would feel like the moments before you describe going out to perform or skate, it's really like there's this 20% luck piece of like, is everything going to come together? Is everything going to happen the way it's supposed to? I think one time you detailed just like letting your body take over and muscle memory. So as you look back on your career and everything that you put in, how much of it do you feel was really like in your control ultimately?
I mean, there's a lot that is in your control, but there is a tough pill to swallow of sports, and probably life too. It's just the concept of you can do everything right, and sometimes it still goes wrong. Like sometimes it just still doesn't work out, and that's just life. And in the same way, sometimes you do get lucky where you didn't do everything right leading up to it and it went well. And that was really difficult, especially as like a perfectionist to handle, where it's like, but I did literally everything perfectly and it didn't end up perfect. And anything less than that would be a disappointment. And that's just too much going on in one's head. Prior to going out to compete. I think the hardest part of competing in some of those really hard events are the ones that I really felt like I did absolutely everything that one could have done leading up to it, and it still didn't go well.
I really appreciated how open you were about your eating disorder and your struggles with body image. And that's something that we touched on a few years ago when we spoke. And even just reading it back so vividly and relating in my own ways. I mean, if anyone survived the 2000s and didn't Google how to be anorexic, kudos to them, because that was hard to avoid. And honestly, like, seeing some of the lengths that you went to, and you talk about how you developed this, I don't know whether you'd call it an addiction or not, but this obsession with laxatives and the calorie counting. And I honestly felt really seen in the ways of, okay, so even the Olympians did this.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was completely pro Anna. Trigger warning. Just because the thought of going into the rink being bigger, the amount of shame that triggered within me was overwhelming, and I was willing to literally do anything to prevent that from happening. Just the intense shame that it triggered in me. 99% of my mental breakdowns from like 2013 until even sometimes now, they are 99% of the time related to body dysmorphia, body, like anything, eating disorders, like it all will come back to that somehow.
I also was feeling for you when you talked about how it was that first comment made by one of your former coaches, Alex. And prior to that, you had never really thought about it. And you were like, my pregame meal was whatever was in the vending machine. And I think any person who ends up developing some sort of eating disorder does have that like light switch moment. And usually the light turning on is a good thing, but in this case, it's not, where you're sent on this completely different trajectory. And do you sometimes think like, if if it had been someone else, or if that comment wasn't said, maybe I wouldn't have had these struggles? Or do you think it might have been inevitable with the sport of figure skating having such heavy scrutiny on image?
I worry that in some ways it was probably inevitable because the amount of people in the world that aren't competitive figure skaters that have eating disorders just tells me that it's not necessarily unique to being in a like skinny sports or profession. But that is the origin story. But it's also, I mean, me just kind of being, I can be the best at everything. And I was like, I can totally be the best anorexic. I can absolutely do that. The other title that I really liked for the book was called Failed Anorexic, because that was at the Out of Shape Worthless Loser inner voice was the bigger arc, but also one of the subgroups was, you know, I was like, and I failed at this as well. First off, I just think that's like a hilarious title. Secondly, just the shame I felt when I felt like I failed at not eating and just how dark that was. It probably was inevitable, but I think when it became tied in with the feelings of shame, that I should be ashamed that I'm bigger than I should be. I should be ashamed that I ate whatever for lunch. That's like when it really became problematic. I think that if we could take the shame out of it and just be factual, like if you have to, in a sport where you have to lift your body weight over the course of 4 minutes and 10 seconds and have long lines and like all the blah, 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 a lighter frame, like a smaller frame, a leaner frame might be better, or it might be easier to jump higher if you weighed less. Like that isn't necessarily a completely out of pocket. You know, there's a way to talk to people about managing weight without making them feel like shit. And that just wasn't presented to me.
Mm-hmm. It is such a shameful feeling for some reason when someone makes a comment about our body. And I think it goes to a point that you've made in the book, which is height is something you can't control. There's certain things out of your control and you have to shrug your shoulders and move on. But when someone makes a comment about weight or hair color, you know, those are things that we can technically tweak if we want. And so it is that feeling of like, oh my gosh, how could I not have done this or seen this? Because technically, like, they'll view me as someone who, I don't know, didn't care or didn't understand what I should have been. And so then you take it personally.
Yeah. And just the shame of that, as if somehow, you know, I wouldn't have bombed at Worlds if I had simply not eaten dinner. Like that concept is crazy, but also you're like, oh my God, if that was it, like it is my fault. And why can't I just be skinny like other people? Why is it so hard for me? And eating disorders are also like perfect for control freaks, which sometimes I can struggle with that because you can control absolutely 100% of what you put in your mouth and how much like you try to burn. I mean, these are things that are absolutely in your control, assuming you don't have like a metabolic issue. So for a control freak, it's like the perfect coping mechanism. As well as I kind of talk in the book, eating disorders are really glamorized, even like still sometimes in society, but especially in the 2000s, like early 2010s. It wasn't until that you were literally dying that people were like, oh, we have a problem here. But until then, it was a lot of those behaviors where they really were glamorized. You were congratulated on them. People were really impressed by your discipline.
Yes, they'd admire how are you not eating? Teach me how, right? Like it was this group effort.
Yeah, that's a darker and like bigger struggle. And it is a tricky addiction to handle because unlike other addictions, you know, you can cut out heroin, you can cut out crystal, you can cut out alcohol, but you can't entirely cut out food. So you have to learn how to manage this addiction of either restriction or binging or other. Same with, I mean, over exercising. It's like you can't just cut out moving your body entirely. So you have to manage it, which is extremely difficult. And the acknowledgement of that eating disorders, you have to fit a certain weight limit before society would even consider you to have one. And that if you are, certainly if you're bigger, that's not an eating disorder, right? That's a lack of discipline, right, is kind of the rhetoric. As opposed to, I think, you know, you don't have to qualify. I think that if you use heroin once, like you qualified of like, there's something very wrong here. But with eating disorders, it's not quite like that.
And it's this, exactly what you said. It's this thing that you need to live. So you can't just be like, okay, I'm just like never going to eat again. Like you have to have it. And so you have to figure out how am I going to have this relationship in a healthy way, especially coming from a not healthy way.
And I think as this generation move up, I kind of talk about it in the book, but I think a lot of the almond moms, probably what they'd be called on TikTok. But I feel like in some ways back in the day, specifically again, kind of speaking of eating disorders, there wasn't any type of body positivity movement to my knowledge, like back in those days. You know, a lot of the older coaches and people that are influential in skating are still living in that time period. And I still think the glamorization of the working 120 hours a week, like, you know, just absolutely to push yourself to the brink to accomplish something, certainly in this society, that's super glamorized and it is super impressive. And if you are not constantly pushing yourself to the top, climbing the corporate ladder, that you are complacent, that you're not a dreamer, and it's somehow less. But, you know, to push yourself to your body falling apart because of how hard you worked, there is it's almost like there should be like pride in that. Like I almost feel like
Yeah.
people are like, that feeling it used to give me was like, oh, I'm better than everybody else. Like I'm
Right.
better than other people. That was like another version of kind of the high that I chased. Was undoubtedly, I'm sure a therapist would say, because I had such low self-esteem of myself, that I had to seek validation from others. And I got it from really doing crazy things, but for the Olympics, and then suddenly everything was okay. Like if you only sleep 4 hours and there's crazy hours, yeah, there's like admiration to be found in it, which is like super dark.
Also in the book, when I got to, I think it's the 11th chapter and it's titled Innocence Lost, this is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the first times you'd opened up about experiencing sexual assault in your own life. And what was it that made you want to tell this story at all? Because survivors, of course, have that choice. And I'm curious your mindset, especially when you detailed the way that it was one of the first things in your life you didn't even feel comfortable talking to your sister Carly about.
Yeah, I mean, the shame of like sexual assault is, again, it's really easy, I think, to say, like, why don't you just come forward? I mean, I experienced it. It's absolutely not. And I'm a relatively honest person. It was a very life-changing experience and like a big T trauma in my life, and to not share it would do like the whole memoir a disservice, really, of saying, again, just like the selective vulnerability. And it's a huge part of my story, however uncomfortable it is for readers or for myself. And it also, I feel like, played into the difficulties of the John chapter and navigating that, you know, as a victim of rape myself. I just feel like it was very relevant. I couldn't leave such like a traumatic and really, you know, life trajectory altering thing out of a memoir.
Mm-hmm. And you had said at one point in the book that you had a conversation with some old white man on the phone about this, which is just, I mean, so many things wrong with the system and the way that they, quote, try to comfort in absolutely not comforting survivors. Have you pursued that case or injustice any further? Or has it been something you've decided to continue, you know, healing in your own life and advocating in your own life?
There is an open gate safe report on it. So there are some details and things that I couldn't discuss in the book, like for legal purposes, that were out of my control. But yeah, it's still an open, marked like active case.
What has your life been like since that? And what is something that you don't feel like the general public knows when they see, you know, survivors coming forward, and then we have the typical stereotypes or judgments, you know, the things that keep survivors silent. You know, as you've gone on in your life, how involved has the healing been in your everyday to try to move forward from something, but know that you ultimately you can't go back in time?
It's been really difficult. It was very difficult to have intimate relationships with like any and all genders for a period of time after that, and to just feel the shame, because in a lot of ways, right, women are always taught like how to prevent it instead of, you know, like where's like the lectures for men. And as someone who has a lot of male friends, it's like, you guys definitely know statistically somebody who has raped a woman. I'm so sorry to tell you that. I don't know who it is in your life, but stats say that you know somebody who's part of the problem. And that in some ways, though, just shoving information down. So I've experienced all of the talks, the color changing nail polish, the stuff about your drink, don't do this. And of course, the stereotypical, like, don't wear that. And
Right. It's all how women can avoid this situation and not actually going to the men and saying, stop assaulting and raping women. When actually, I should share Brenda Tracy's stuff with you. She's an amazing survivor, and she goes and speaks to men and basically says what you're saying, like, you guys are the root of the problem. So we're going to start here. Because there's all this, how to prevent or how to avoid. And I even felt in reading the reasons that you said you stayed silent for so long. And, for me to say this happened on a night that I was drinking, it's going to come back as my fault or me being irresponsible. But something Brenda Tracy says I love is rape should never be the consequence of. Insert anything, a short skirt, drinking, going out, not having a buddy. It's never okay, no matter what the situation is.
No, I mean, absolutely. And some of that rhetoric, in some ways, I feel the shame that comes with, being raped is that it's like, oh, I failed. Like, I didn't do what they're always telling you to do. Like, I was drinking and found myself in a room alone with a man. But part of my healing was being like, oh yeah, so like I should be able to do both of those things without being raped. Like, that's just what that should be. Certainly once you vocalize, absolutely clear as day, no, it can't continue at all. I mean, it just, the shame of being like, oh, I failed. Like, there were things in my control that I didn't do. And it's like, that's horseshit. I didn't do anything wrong.
Correct.
I was raped. Like, I'm the victim. He was the one who did everything incorrectly.
Since sharing this with the world, first starting with your sister and your friends and family, and then now in your memoir, has it made you feel more power of the situation?
No, there are plenty of people in my life that I don't think like really know. And so as far as like power from it or what other people are saying, I kind of healed, I think, the most that one can, even prior to writing the book. This is a big T trauma that happens. I don't have shame about it anymore. And my options are to not be able to trust men or have an intimate like relationship with one, or, I'm going to try to move forward the best that I can. I would say that in some ways I feel entirely indifferent about it because that's more comfortable for me. I don't feel like I need to feel like a hero in this scenario. This was a trauma that I've worked with therapists and I've like processed. And it's just this thing that happened to me, but it doesn't carry weight anymore.
And I just want to say, and I'm sure the world will feel this once they have your book in their hands, but thank you so much, Gracie, because there's not enough people really talking about this in such a candid way. So I know that this is going to inspire so many women, especially, to come forward and to feel more comfortable in what's happened to them. So I hope you know that. And thank you for being so vulnerable in everything, but especially this.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Of course. So you've had such a whirlwind journey of so many ups and downs that have led you to this point. And is figure skating still in your life?
That's a great question. I have trouble imagining a point where it won't be in my life some way. In what capacity, or what role I play in the sport. I'm not sure. I was out this entire season from competition because of a hip injury. So right now I'm in Colorado Springs doing rehab and physical therapy on it. So I guess part of it is like, we'll see how that goes. If it recovers well enough to even consider the idea of skating competitively, or just, I wonder if I'll have any limitations or if it'll be like a brand new hip. So, that's kind of the first step. And if I can or can't skate competitively. And then after that, we'll just see, maybe there's something else that'll jump out. I don't know if it's commentary or if it's perhaps working like with US figure skating and trying to make like real differences and changes in the sports, or just coaching. Like, we'll see.
I love that. And you would be an amazing commentator. I would certainly love to hear if you keep the signature Gracie candor. And then lastly, a big thing for all athletes is identity. And your identity was, clearly laid out for you when you were young in the headlines and even with your last name. And I know you joke about that a lot. How do you view your identity now in this stage in life? Whether you are able to skate again competitively or not, or if you're a coach or you're not, how do you think about Gracie?
I have to like actively remind myself that like my self-worth is not based on my productivity or what I can do for others, or if I'm like the best athlete or the best at anything, and that I can just simply exist, without having to do anything or be anything. And my identity, I've never been able to be like, oh, this is how I define myself, or this is my identity. I just feel like on some level, I've kind of always known who I am, and or certain things that are part of me. And again, the book, right, talks about reconciling these kind of three parts of me and eventually trying to get them maybe into like one whole person. So the answers, I guess it's this combination of my inner child. I have the Olympic superstar, and then I also have the, dark and mentally ill, right, the out of shape, worthless loser. And I have all of these parts of me, and like that's okay, and that I don't have to fit into whatever mold I feel like society wants me to or what other people want me to, because it's simply not me.
Yeah. I love that so much. I've been trying to work on just not even like defining myself, because I think our world does try to put us in boxes all the time and like make sense of things. But what if, there's nothing to make sense of really?
I don't think you have to know, and I think like that's okay. I've never been very good at answering that question, even in my most like perfectly trained media days. And I just don't. I'm just like a person who's just like trying their best. That's what I'm. It's like what I'm
Preach. Love
doing.
it. Aren't we all? Thank you so much, Gracie. I so appreciate you coming back on Real Pod a second time. I love speaking with you. I'm so excited for the world to read your book. I cannot recommend it enough. So I hope everyone goes and gets it. It is out now. So make sure you go to the link in the description and you can purchase your own copy of Out of Shape, Worthless Loser, because you will not want to put it down.
No, thank you for having me again, and thanks for reading the book. Really, really appreciate it.